The coffee shop on Fifth Avenue was nothing special. Just another spot where strangers came in, got their drinks, and went back to their busy days. But for Emma Chun, it had become a safe place. Every morning at 7:15, she would grab the corner table by the window, open her laptop, and dive into her work as a freelance graphic designer. She had noticed him 3 weeks ago. He always ordered the same thing, a large black coffee and a blueberry muffin. He would sit 2 tables away, pull out a worn leather notebook, and write with the kind of focus that made Emma wonder what secrets he was putting on paper. His dark hair was always messy, as if he'd just run his fingers through it. And he had this habit of pausing in the middle of a sentence to stare out the window, his pen hovering over the page like a bird, not sure where to land. Emma had never been the type to approach strangers. Her last relationship had ended 8 months ago when David decided that her artistic pursuits weren't practical enough for their future. Since then, she'd built walls around her heart, focusing on her work and convincing herself that being alone was safer than the risk of another broken promise. But there was something about the stranger that made her curious. Maybe it was the way he smiled at the elderly barista Maria, or how he always left his table spotless, chair pushed in just so. Small gestures that spoke of kindness, a quality that had become increasingly rare in Emma's world. On this particular Tuesday morning, autumn light came through the cafe windows, casting golden streaks across the worn wooden floors. Emma was struggling with a particularly challenging logo design for a local bookstore when she noticed the stranger wasn't writing. Instead, he was staring directly at her. Heat rushed to her cheeks as their eyes met. He didn't look away, didn't pretend he hadn't been caught. Instead, he offered a soft smile that made her stomach flutter in a way she hadn't felt in months. Emma quickly turned back to her screen, her heart hammering against her ribs. 5 minutes passed. Then, when she finally gathered the courage to glance up again, he was back to writing. But there was something different about his posture. More relaxed, perhaps, as if that brief moment of connection had settled something in him. 2. The morning routine continued for another week. Stolen glances, tentative smiles, the kind of silent conversation that happens between 2 people who are simultaneously drawn to each other and terrified of what that attraction might mean. Emma found herself arriving earlier, leaving later, hoping for just one more glimpse of him. She learned that he drank his coffee slowly, savoring each sip, that he sometimes laughed quietly at whatever he was writing, that he had a small scar above his left eyebrow that became more visible when he concentrated. She was falling for a stranger, and it both thrilled and terrified her. On Friday morning, everything changed. Emma was running late. A client call had gone longer than expected, and when she rushed into the cafe, the stranger was already preparing to leave. He had his jacket on, notebook tucked under his arm, but he paused when he saw her. For a moment that stretched like eternity, they simply looked at each other across the busy cafe. Then he walked over to her table. "Excuse me," he said, and his voice was softer than she'd imagined, with the faintest hint of an accent she couldn't place. "I know this might sound strange, but I've been sitting in this cafe every morning for almost a month now, and I can't help but notice that you're always working on something beautiful." Emma's breath caught. Up close, his eyes were the color of storm clouds, grey-blue and infinitely deep. "Thank you. I'm a graphic designer." "And James," he said, extending his hand. "James Whitmore." Emma. His hand was warm, calloused in a way that suggested he worked with them for more than just writing. "Emma Chun." "Emma," he repeated as if testing how her name felt on his tongue. "I have what might be considered a strange request." She raised an eyebrow, trying to ignore how her name sounded like music when he said it. Strange how James glanced. around the cafe, then back at her, and she saw vulnerability in his expression that made her chest tighten. I'm a writer. Well, trying to be one. I've been working on this novel for 2 years now, and I keep getting stuck on the same scene. My editor says I need to understand what love looks like from the outside before I can write it convincingly. Okay. Emma wasn't sure where this was going, but she found herself leaning forward, drawn in by the earnestness in his voice. Would you be willing to help me, just for a few hours? I'd like to observe how two people who are attracted to each other behave. The small gestures, the way they look at each other. I know it sounds ridiculous, but you want me to pretend to be in love with you. The words came out more sharply than Emma intended, but the request felt too close to her recent wounds. Playing at love when her heart was still healing from the real thing. James's cheeks flushed pink. Not pretend exactly, more like act naturally. I've watched you work for weeks, and there's something about the way you approach your art. The concentration, the passion. It's the same thing I'm trying to capture in my characters. Emma stared at him, her mind racing. It was the most unusual request she'd ever received. And yet something about his honesty, his willingness to be vulnerable made her consider it. What would this involve exactly? Maybe we could spend an afternoon together, get coffee somewhere new, walk around the city, talk, just exist in each other's company while I take notes on the dynamics between us. He paused, running a hand through his hair. I know how this sounds. If you say no, I completely understand. I'll go back to my table over there and pretend this conversation never happened. The offer was so genuine, so completely different from any game playing she'd experienced before that. Emma found herself nodding before she could second-guess the decision. Okay. Yes, I'll help you with your research. She smiled and saw his entire face light up in response. But I have conditions. Name them. First, if this gets weird or uncomfortable for either of us, we stop. No questions asked. Agreed. Second, I want to read what you write about our experiment. James hesitated, then nodded. Fair enough. Though you might not like what you see, writers tend to notice things that others miss. Try me. They arranged to meet the next afternoon at Washington Square Park. As James walked away, Emma realized she was smiling for the first time in weeks. She had no idea what she'd just agreed to, that something told her that this simple request was about to change everything. Emma found herself standing in front of her closet for 20 minutes, trying to decide what one wears to be observed falling in love. She finally settled on a flowing blue dress that brought out her eyes and her favorite leather jacket, casual enough to seem effortless, but flattering enough to give her confidence. She arrived at the park 10 minutes early, her stomach a tangle of nerves and anticipation. James was already there, sitting on a bench near the fountain with his notebook in his lap, looking just as nervous as she felt. Hi, she said, suddenly shy. Hi. He stood up and she noticed he traded his usual casual clothes for dark jeans and a soft grey sweater that made his eyes look more blue than grey. Thank you for doing this. I wasn't sure you'd actually show up. I always keep my promises, Emma said, then immediately wondered why she'd chosen those particular words. Something about James made her want to reveal pieces of herself she usually kept hidden. Good to know, he said softly. So, where would you like to start? They began walking, and Emma was surprised by how natural it felt. James asked about her work, her move to the city, her favorite places to find inspiration. In return, she learned that he'd grown up in Ireland, moved to New York 5 years ago for graduate school, and stayed because the city had gotten under his skin. What's your novel about? Emma asked as they paused to watch street musicians perform near the arch. James's expression grew more serious. It's about second chances, about Two people who meet at the worst possible time in their lives and have to decide whether love is worth the risk of more heartbreak. The words hit Emma like a physical blow. It was as if he'd reached into her chest and described exactly what she'd been feeling for months. That sounds complicated. Love usually is. His eyes met hers, and there was something in his gaze that made her wonder if this conversation was still about his fictional characters. Have you ever been in love, Emma? The question was so direct, so unexpected that Emma felt her defenses rise. Why do you ask? For the book, he said quickly. But there was something in his tone that suggested it was more than that. I'm trying to understand what it feels like when you're in that space between hoping and protecting yourself. Emma was quiet for a long moment, watching a couple on a nearby bench share a bag of pretzels, laughing at some private joke. I thought I was in love once, she said finally. Turned out I was in love with the idea of being in love, with what I thought the future could look like. What happened? He decided I wasn't practical enough, that my dreams were nice hobbies, but not something to build a life around. The words still stung, even months later. So, I learned that sometimes the person you love sees you as a rough draft instead of a finished story. James stopped walking. When Emma turned to look at him, his expression was intense, almost angry. He was an idiot. You don't even know me. I know enough. James's voice was firm. I know that you approach your work with more passion than most people approach anything in their entire lives. I know that you're kind to the barista, even when she gets your order wrong. I know that you have this way of tucking your hair behind your ear when you're concentrating. That's completely unconscious and absolutely beautiful. Emma's breath caught. James. I know this was supposed to be research, he continued, his notebook falling forgotten to the ground. But I need you to know something. That request yesterday, it wasn't really about my book. What do you mean? I mean, I've been trying to work up the courage to talk to you for 3 weeks. The book was just an excuse. His cheeks flushed, but he didn't look away. I kept telling myself I was being professional, that I was just observing interesting people for my writing. But the truth is, I haven't been able to write a single scene that doesn't somehow feature a woman with dark hair who bites her lip when she's thinking. Emma felt the world shift around her. So, this whole thing was me being too much of a coward. To just ask you to have coffee with me like a normal person. James ran his hands through his hair. I'm sorry. I know I've probably ruined everything now, but I couldn't spend another afternoon pretending this was just research when every minute with you makes me realize how much I want this to be real. They stood there in the middle of the park, people, walking around them like stones in a stream, and Emma felt something crack open in her chest. It wasn't the careful, calculated attraction she'd felt with David. This was Messier, more immediate, more terrifying. This was the feeling of standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing you wanted to jump. Emma. James's voice was quiet, uncertain. Say something, please. She looked at him, really looked, taking in the hope and fear warring in his expression, the way he was holding himself so still as if any movement might break whatever spell had been cast between them. And she realized that somewhere in the past few hours she'd started falling too. Your research methods are terrible, she said. Finally, his face fell. I know. I'm sorry. But your instincts about people are pretty good. Emma stepped closer, close enough to see the flecks of blue in his grey eyes. I've been making excuses. To stay at the cafe longer. Really. Instead of answering with words, Emma reached up and touched the small scar above his eyebrow, the one she'd been curious about for weeks. James's eyes fluttered closed at the contact, and when he opened them again, she saw her own longing reflected back at her. This is crazy, she whispered. Completely insane, he agreed. But his hands came up to frame her face. thumbs tracing her cheekbones with reverent gentleness. I don't do impulsive. Neither do I'm scared, me too. And then he was kissing her. Soft and sweet and tentative, like a question she was answering with her whole body. Emma's hands fisted in his sweater, pulling him closer, and she heard him make a soft sound of surprise and pleasure that made her stomach flip. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, James rested his forehead against hers. So he said, voice. Rough. Still willing to help with my research. Emma laughed, and the sound surprised her with its lightness. For the first time in months, she felt like herself again. Not the careful, guarded version she'd become, but the woman who believed in taking chances, in the possibility that something beautiful might grow from something unexpected. Only if you promise me something, she said. Anything. Promise me this isn't just material for your book, that whatever this is between us, it gets to exist for its own sake. James's smile was soft and sure, and absolutely devastating. Emma Chun, he said, I promise you that some stories are too important to be fiction. As the sun set over Washington Square Park, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Emma realized that sometimes the most important moments in life begin with the simplest requests. A writer looking for inspiration. A woman willing to take a chance. One look that changed everything. The future stretched out before them, uncertain and full of possibility. And for the first time in a long time, Emma wasn't afraid of what might come next. After all, the best stories were the ones you couldn't predict. The ones that surprised you with their tenderness, their truth, their ability to transform ordinary moments into something extraordinary. And this, she thought as James took her hand and they walked deeper into the city lights. This felt like the beginning of the most beautiful story she'd ever been part of writing. 3 months later, Emma would find James's notebook on their shared kitchen counter, open to a page titled Research Notes. Instead of clinical observations, she would discover pages of poetry about the way morning light caught in her hair. Sketches of her hands as she worked, and a single sentence written and rewritten dozens of times. How do you tell someone that they've become the answer to every question you never knew how to ask? That discovery was still ahead of them. For now, there was just this 2 people who had been brave enough to admit that sometimes the most profound connections begin with the courage to be vulnerable, to ask for help, to believe that love might be worth the risk after all. As they disappeared into the crowd, the notebook James had dropped lay forgotten on the park path, pages fluttering in the evening breeze. If anyone had stopped to read the words scattered across the open pages, they would have found not research notes, but the beginning of a love story. One that started with a simple request and grew into something neither Emma nor James could have imagined when they were just strangers sharing the same coffee shop, the same quiet morning routine, the same secret hope that somewhere in this vast city someone was looking back.